The licensing model is a real favourite amongst entrepreneurs because it can generate really healthy margins. So here's a couple of examples. Qualcomm makes most of its revenue from selling processors, but it makes most of its profits from licensing its designs and its intellectual property. And certainly in financial year 2015, it made $6.8 billion from licensing alone. The following year, Nokia generated 40% of its profits purely from licensing. So it can be a hugely profitable part of a business model. So there's three main types to look at here. Now, I will say that this is quite a niche, not a niche, but a specialist area that can get very complex and does require some legal input usually. But don't let that put you off, because there are some basic principles here that you can fold into a business model. So the first really is, what do we license? We are licensing data, we're licensing assets, we're licensing intellectual property directly. So that could either be, we have something that you need that is either exclusive, so think of Disney and selling their rights for merchandise. So it's either exclusive, or it's cheaper for you to license something than to make it. So for example, if you think about Uber, it doesn't have its own mapping software, it licenses Google's because it's cheaper to do it that way. So that's the first thing. It's about a direct licensing. Now, sometimes, just as a sub point here, it can be better to license your rights than do the manufacturing yourself or the production yourself, simply because there is a bigger marketplace out there who can do a better job than you can. So ARM, for example, by 2014 they had 50 billion computer chips manufactured through its designs, but it didn't manufacture any of them. It was all about the licensing. So those are some examples around the direct selling of intellectual property and licensing. But what about indirect? Well, that's another model to consider as well. So if you think about a photographer selling their images through Getty Images, and Getty would pay them a royalty on a per usage basis, that's an indirect way of having your intellectual property licensed to third parties through an aggregator. And then there's another layer on that. I mean, you can choose to move from being purely an IP creator and licenser and extending the scope of what you do, and saying, do you know what, we're going to be the go-to place for specific types of data or licensing, whether you produce it or whether you're selling somebody else's. So again, Getty is a good example of that. They have their own photographers that they send out, and they take pictures for Getty that get sold, and Getty gets the whole of the deal, whole of the money, the royalty. And they'll have other photographers sending in their images, and they get paid a royalty as well. But the choice is to be the aggregator, and you are the central licenser for all intellectual property, if you like, in that particular area. And that's another business model in its own right. But that's a choice. That's a bigger question about the purpose of the organization. So some key questions around the licensing model when you're thinking about designing a business model in this way. The first is, do you have access to data or assets or intellectual property that is valuable to others and cheaper for them to license than to create it for themselves? So that's the first thing to think about. Who are they, and what value exchange would work? Maybe it doesn't always have to be money. It could be like for like. It could be data that you sell that allows them to create revenue, and you take a kickback on some of the revenue. You can get really creative with how this works. Then thinking about how much revenue could this contribute to the business model portfolio, and then taking it further, you might identify that there are partners around the edges of your system, your ecosystem, who would find it extremely valuable if you developed a certain type of IP that they can't do themselves. And you might make a deliberate choice around your product or service to add a little bit extra on that creates some new IP, creates some new data that's then suddenly unlocks a whole new revenue stream from partners that are sitting around the edge of that. And sometimes you can do that by working with universities and switching on quick access, quick creation of IP that is suddenly hugely valuable and helps you fund another part of the business model. So there are a few factors to bear in mind with the licensing model. The first is, I guess this goes without saying, your IP that you're licensing needs to be legally protected in a really unambiguous and defendable way. The second is, ideally, you are the only, or at least the leading solution to solving a relevant problem on the market. That makes your licensing much more valuable. And thirdly, it should be not easy to imitate or work around. Again, these are things that just make your intellectual property and assets more valuable. So licensing, if you can crack that, is a really, really lucrative way of earning money and funding your business model.